Right. Good morning. A very warm welcome to the Nuffield Foundation this morning, both to those of you that have joined us in person and to those of you that are joining online. It's great to see so many of you here, and thank you all for your time. My name's Alex Beer. I am Programme Head in the Welfare Domain here at the Nuffield Foundation, and I'm going to be chairing you through this morning's event. For those of you that don't know us, the Nuffield Foundation is an independent charitable trust, and our mission is to advance social well-being. We do this by funding research and analysis in the areas of education, welfare, and justice to help better understand the issues affecting people's life chances and the trends and the disruptive forces that are changing the structure and context of people's lives. It's our aim that the research that we fund informs social policy and ultimately makes a difference to people's lives by demonstrating how we might address inequalities, discrimination, and vulnerabilities in an increasingly diverse and fragmented society. Now, juggling work and family life, including caring for other family members as well as children, is a common feature of many people's lives. But the intersections between work and care, the gendered aspects of this, and the implications for individual and family well-being are relatively under-researched. As part of our welfare portfolio, we are particularly keen to support research in this area, but there are also important intersections with our education interests in children's educational opportunity and life chances, and our justice interests in protecting people's rights. The Nuffield Foundation is therefore delighted to be funding the important research that's being published today, with thanks to Birgitta Rabe, Jo Blandon, Claire Crawford, and Laura Fumagalli. We're also funders of the IFS Deaton Review of Inequalities, represented here today by Lucinda Platt. We've funded some of the research looking at family time use and child development during the pandemic that Almudena has been associated with, and we produced the Changing Face of Early Childhood series, led by Carey Oppenheim, which drew on Nuffield-funded research and beyond to provide a holistic account of the experience of contemporary early childhood. Through our events programme, we also look beyond Nuffield-funded work to bring together different combinations of expertise and experience that otherwise might not connect in the same way. And so I'm delighted to extend a very warm welcome to all of today's presenters and discussants, including Megan and Josie, and also John Penrose, who we hope will be joining us later. And also, a huge warm welcome to bring that sort of diversity of experience and expertise to those of you that have joined us in person and those of you that have joined online. So we've got quite a packed schedule today. We've got 4 presenters, then we're going to have a short coffee break, and then followed by a panel discussion later on. During the presentations, we hope there's going to be some time for questions of clarification, but the main sort of question and answer session will be during the panel discussion. Might I take this opportunity to say that people online can contribute to the chat and also ask questions. Might I suggest that those of you that if you have a question, to put it in the Q&A section, and if you just want to share some information or reflections on the event or raise awareness of sort of other pieces of research or interesting insights, that you put that in the chat. Both the chat and the questions will be monitored, and later on when it comes to the questions, you'll be able to upvote those. We'll be taking a rather more traditional approach in line, and I'll be sort of asking you to introduce yourself and where you're from before asking your questions. Those of you that are joining us online can turn on live captions by clicking more options or the 3 dots and then turn on live captions. Also with housekeeping, there is no fire alarm planned. So if the fire alarm sounds, then follow the directions of staff down the stairs and out of the building. Yes, and so I think that is it for housekeeping right now. So without further ado, might I introduce our fantastic presenters today. Birgitta Rabe, Professor of Economics at the Institute for Social and Economic Research at the University of Essex, will present findings on the impact of school availability on parents' mental health and how this differed for fathers and mothers during the pandemic and why. Birgitta will be followed by Megan Jarvie, Head of CORAM Family and Childcare, who will outline the current crisis in the childcare sector from the point of view of both families and providers and offer suggestions on making the system more sustainable. Almudena, Sevilla, Professor in Economics and Public Policy at LSE, will present on the long-term consequences for gender equality of the pandemic and potential solutions for labour supply. And Lucinda Platt, Professor of Social Policy and Sociology at the London School of Economics and a panel member of the Nuffield-funded Deaton Review of Inequalities, will review trends in gender inequality, both those that can be readily tracked, such as pay, and those that are more subtle, such as time spent caring for others. So I'm not going to interrupt you between each of those presenters, and so they will go in turn. And firstly, I'd like to invite Birgitta up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex, and hello, everyone. And thanks for coming here in person. It's wonderful to see some actual people. And thanks also for joining online, for those of you who are there online. I'm presenting today on our report, which is launched today, on our project COVID-19 and school availability and the impact on parental labor supply and family well-being. This is joint work, as Alex has already said, with Claire Crawford, who is actually here today, and Joe Blandon and Laura Fumagalli, who have joined online. And this report consists of 4 sections. The first part is about school availability and attendance in the pandemic, in the first year of the pandemic. The second part is about parents' mental health in the context of school availability. We also look at parents' labor supply and at children's emotional and behavioral difficulties, so their well-being in the pandemic. And this project has been running for a while, and because it was a COVID rapid response project, we already released interim reports. And for that reason, we thought that today we are going to just pick out some of highlight results to show you and put them in the context of a wider discussion, which is why we're really happy that we have these brilliant speakers and discussants here today to speak on it. So I'm going to be focusing on parent mental health. So what is it that we know about parent mental health? Well, the first fact is not so nice. We know that parents' mental health and well-being is worse than that of adults without children. Obviously, bad mental health has wide-ranging effects on the individuals themselves, but it has economic knock-on effects and also for healthcare. And through parents, obviously, their involvement with children, it also impacts children's development and welfare. So it is quite important to look at parent mental health. We know that the bad mental health of parents is caused, at least in part, by the demands of housework and childcare. And that's why we think that childcare can be an important aspect of which has previously not been considered enough about how parents do. So I'm going to be, right, so this is the slide that I've just been speaking to, apologies for that, and what we know about mental health. So all in all, we think that the benefits of childcare might be further than what we've previously been discussing. It's always been discussed in the context of parents' labor supply and child development, but little attention has been given to parent mental health. And now the pandemic and the school closures that followed are basically a good opportunity, as sad as it was, to understand more about how it affects families' well-being. As we know, the jobs and livelihoods through policies were protected quite well in the pandemic, but childcare was suddenly and completely withdrawn by the closure of childcare settings and schools basically overnight. We know that mothers took on most of the domestic work in the pandemic, and this has been shown by Almudena, who will speak, amongst others, who will speak later. And we have also been shown by studies that were tracking the mental health, that mental health declined for both mothers and fathers over the pandemic. But in our work, we were interested specifically what's the contribution of childcare or school closures in our case to this decline in mental health. Okay. Right. So the way that we investigate this in the project is I would like you to look at this timeline and put your minds back into the year 2020, when suddenly school closed for everyone on the 23rd of March and remained closed until the beginning of June, when there was government guidance that some children should be returning to school, but not all of them. And there was priority given to reception in year 1 and the year 6s in primary school. And so this is the kind of the variation that we're going to be using to be looking at the effect of school closures on various outcomes. And then by around the 20th of July, all the children would have been in school holidays. And from September, everyone was back at school. But when I say everyone, that's not quite true, because we had localized lockdowns. You remember the bubble system and all of that. So we have a priority group to return in June and July, reception year 1, year 2. And so that allows us to compare the changes in mental health of parents whose children were all in those priority groups and those parents who had children who were not in priority groups and therefore were still at home with the parents. And we can make this comparison to the April-May situation when schools were closed for everyone. And then we're looking at the effect of school opening. And we can also turn it around to compare with the pre-pandemic years, and that allows us to look at the effect of school closures. And actually in the report, you will see that we are doing both of those things. The data that we're going to use is from Understanding Society, which we produce at Essex. And early on in the pandemic, we launched the COVID-19 study already from April, which collected information from parents via the web. We're going to focus on young children in our research, for whom parents it's most relevant whether they are at home. And the main measure of current mental well-being will come from the General Health Questionnaire. There are 12 questions asked of mothers, and I've given you 3 examples on the right-hand side of the types of questions that are in this measure, like have you recently felt capable of making decisions, felt under stress, and enjoyed your daily activities. And depending on where you do your cross, there's different points that are then added up into an aggregate score, which we use in this research. So in order to look at those priority groups, what we first want to establish is whether actually school attendance and availability even use this guidance, because some schools may not have offered places or have offered them for other children, and some families might not have taken it up. So if you look just at the 2 bars on the left-hand side, the bigger, lighter one is for children in the priority groups, and you can see that 80% of children had a school offered to them in the June, July of 2020, whereas in the non-priority groups, it was only about 30%. So a big difference. And the darker shadings within each bar shows you how many pupils actually took up the offer, because some parents decided, no, actually, we don't want to send our children. It's too dangerous, or for other reasons. But we do see there's a big difference between the priority and non-priority groups. In the report, we also look at background and place characteristics that are that show you that there's quite a lot of variation actually in how much schools offered places and families took them up, and that's quite important to look at as well, and you can see more about that in the report. Yeah, I'm just giving you the example of regions, but we also look at it by ethnic background, for example, finding that ethnic minority families were both less likely to have offered school and taken it up, in many cases for good reasons. As we know, the health risks were concentrated among these groups. So this is our main, having established that there was a difference in taking up school between priority and non-priority schools, families. Now we go to the effect on mental health. And what you see here is the comparison between parents who had a place offered to them and those that didn't. And I'm showing you this effect over time. So the June effect on the first on the left is the contemporaneous effect on mental health. And then the subsequent months, July, that's already at the end of July, summer holidays, September, when the school restarted. These points are basically measuring whether there's any persistent effect over time. And you can see two different panels, one for mothers, one for fathers. And looking at the dots, those are the estimates, and the lines are the confidence intervals. Where they intersect that zero line, we cannot be sure that actually the effect is different to zero. So looking across, what you will see is that in June we have an effect for mothers, but already by the summer holidays, this has gone away. And so these effects do not persist. And we find no effect whatsoever for the fathers, which is quite a striking difference. And I'm going to talk next about what the size of these effects actually mean. So this June effect for mothers is a 1.5 reduction in the GHQ score. So if you remember back to the little questionnaire I showed you earlier, this is like going from being unhappy or depressed, for example, on one of those questions, going from much more than usual to rather than more than usual or no more than usual, somewhere in between there. So this is an improvement of mental health because remember, we're measuring the effect of schools reopening. And another way to put this into context is that this is quite a severe, strong effect. If you flip it into a negative thing, it's equivalent to the time leading up to a divorce or the time after the partner lost the job. So quite a severe effect. And considering that we're only measuring the effect of having your children prioritized rather than actually attending, if we were to estimate the effect of actually attending school, we expect this to be considerably larger, meaning that we find severe mental health effect on mothers, but not on fathers. So what's driving these effects? We had the hypothesis when we started the work that possibly women couldn't carry on, mothers or fathers couldn't carry on with their jobs in the usual way because they were caring for children at home. So we were expecting, and this could lead to worse mental health. But what we did find that the mothers that we focus on, because this is where we see the bad mental health effects, did not change their working hours, nor did they change whether they worked or not, or their earnings. Nothing changed. So what we suspect is it's actually this double burden of working and looking after your children and homeschooling, which has disproportionately been placed on mothers. Another thing that we can look at is the role of social isolation, which has been highlighted in other papers as a possible driver of this mental health effect. And we do find for a measure of loneliness that as soon as children are prioritized to go back to school, we find that loneliness reduces considerably for mothers in the same month, as you can see in this graph. So much for the results. As I say, much more is in the report. We have a few printed copies today, but just a few to save the forest. But the report has also been published online today, both on the Nuffield and the University of Essex website. So I'm going to turn now to different lessons. So we can look at like kind of immediate remedial things that we might need to do. We can look at what we need to do if we consider future school closures, and also look a little bit beyond at the wider implications. So in terms of remedial policy, the most obvious thing that springs to mind is mental health support for for parents. I have shown you that the effect is quite short-lived as far as we can see, but obviously these are average effects. And even if we say there were no mental health effects on fathers, we again, on average. So it might well be that there is an effect on mothers and fathers that is longer lasting. And our research just looks at 7 weeks difference in school availability in the summer of 2020. But as we know, there were further lockdowns in the cold winter months, and we don't know what the cumulative effect of these lockdowns might have been for people. And the other area of our work that I've not talked about at all is children's mental health, which is quite worrying with a lot of signs that these are longer lasting severe effects on children's mental health. So a lot of need for support here. And there are some lessons from our attendance analysis on where to focus catch up in terms of schooling, but also importantly in attendance, because attendance, especially for some disadvantaged group, is way below what it was before the pandemic. And our research points a little bit towards who those groups might be. Looking at school closures, which I really do hope will not happen, but if it is ever considered again, we argue that it is very important to factor in the wider costs. A lot has been said about learning loss of children, but we show that there are much wider costs that need to be factored in when making such decisions. And we do think it's important to take steps now to maximize the chances that schools can stay open, which can include like physical measures, ventilation, distancing, space, but also strategies in terms of staffing and other things like those. Because we've seen teacher availability obviously was also very dependent on infection rates on where people live. And attendance analysis might point to the groups that need to most persuasion to go, but this is with the caveat that some people have good reasons not to go to school. Finally, if schools have to be closed, I think our results point to the need of supporting the whole family and not just offering support in terms of learning, but also in terms of mental well-being, and not just for the children, but also the families themselves. And finally, the wider policy implications. And I think this is where we are gearing this event today, that we want to put this in the wider context of these two areas that I'm going to talk about. One is the state support for childcare. So we have seen that though the circumstances of the pandemic surely were unique because parents obviously didn't have the chance to rearrange their circumstances, but we do think that there is evidence of substantial mental health benefits of childcare. And from what we can see, these are disproportionately benefit women, mothers in families, and by extension, the children as well, because this is kind of the family unit. And I suppose the husbands, the fathers are also impacted by maternal mental health. So these things are very important to factor into the cost benefit when you think about expanding or contracting the availability of childcare, and when you think about the prices that should be attached to childcare. And that's the one point. And the other, and this should also, we think, be considered when you plan school opening times, and also things like providing childcare through the school holidays. So this is one important area, and I think people will be speaking to this point in the course of this event. And the other big area is around gender roles. We have seen that the effects of the pandemic have been gendered in the sense of the mental health, the housework, and all of this. And so we think that the unequal division of unpaid housework is one driver, important driver of this gendered effect of pandemics. And the previous literature actually has shown that similar experiences have occurred before, for example, in the 2008 recession, and when families are hit by other shocks, such as a disability or sickness of a child, it's often the mother who then takes a lot of the hit in terms of employment and looking after that child. So we certainly have a gendered situation when crises and shocks occur. And what can we do about this reaction? That's the other question we would like to raise today. And looking at policies that encourage a more equal division of the housework, we think is an important point here, starting very early in children's lives, having equal leave for fathers and mothers after a child is born, non-transferable leave for fathers, and also other policies that make the work-life balance easier for both mothers and fathers. And I'm sure all the great minds of speakers and discussants that we've lined up here for this event will speak to this much better than I can, but these are kind of the bigger picture implications that we see. So apologies for the mess up with the slides. It's all a bit multitasky, but thanks for listening. And I look forward to hearing what everyone else has to say.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me here today. I'm Megan Jarvie. I'm head of CORAM Family and Childcare, and I'm going to pick up some of those points that you've just raised, Birgitta, around childcare and early education, and linking it into the research today as well, because I think that one of the things I thought about as I was listening to that is how interesting it is that to view school availability as a form of childcare. I think early education we tend to view as childcare first, education second, and school the other way around. And so it's really lovely today to be joining them together, I think, as well. So early education and childcare holds huge potential to really change families' lives in both enabling parents to work and helping to boost children's outcomes, and particularly around narrowing that achievement gap that opens up before children start school between disadvantaged children and their peers. And that's why we've seen investment over the last 20 or 30 years. There have been a series of policy interventions, even during austerity. But the problem with these is that they've focused on one or the other of these two aims. They've either been looking at children's outcomes or they've been looking at parental employment. And the result is that we've got a bit of an incoherent mess, really, that things are often pulling in different directions and acting against each other. And where that leaves us is that from the family point of view, childcare is still eye-wateringly expensive, and it really costs to go out to work, and too often it's just simply not worth it for parents to work once they weigh up their earnings against their childcare costs. There is support out there, but it's really, really confusing. The average family will have 7 different forms of childcare support that they could access, and it's targeted to slightly older children, to around 3 and 4-year-olds, and there's the least support when the costs are highest with young children, 2-year-olds and under, that can really leave parents and mothers in particular struggling to stay and work. And even if you can afford those costs, there are issues around availability. So only just over half of local areas have enough childcare for parents working full time. And those gaps are even bigger for some groups of children. So disabled children, only 1 in 5 areas, parents working atypical hours, or older children, 12 to 14-year-olds is where we see particular gaps. And these gaps in availability, we think, are likely to become bigger. There is a real crisis facing childcare providers, and we're seeing increasingly frequent closures, and particularly short notice closures as well, which ties into what we're talking about today. For many years, childcare providers have been raising concerns about the funding for early education, for the free early education entitlement, is being too low. And the Early Years Alliance have really taken on a battle to prove that. And they took on a 2-year FOI battle with the Department for Education. And they got papers released that showed that that was the case. There was a big gap between what high quality early education costs and what's being paid, and that parents were going to be expected to pick up that difference. But the trouble is for childcare providers is that as the number of funded early education hours increases, there's less and less ability to make up that difference from parents. Government buy more childcare than parents do at the moment. On top of that, we've got rise in the minimum wage, inflation, pressures on childcare workers caused by Brexit and a reduced number of EU nationals working in childcare. And so there's a number of long-term factors that have been putting pressure on the childcare sector. And then, of course, we've got COVID hitting an already fragile sector. And I was part of another study that was funded by Nuffield, and many of the people that work in that are actually here in person today, which looked at the impact of COVID on early education and childcare. And it showed the sector was really shaken by COVID, but that it was particularly disadvantaged children that risked losing the most. So we know that early years professionals have been underpaid and undervalued for a long time. What we saw during COVID is their job also became dangerous. It also became harder. They were talking about children presenting with more issues, more developmental delays. And so we saw morale really hitting an all-time low, that for a long time, the pay has been about the same as working in a supermarket, but now you perhaps got more respect for that as well, for being a key worker in a supermarket, and lots of people simply left the sector. On top of that, our working lives have changed. We have different demands for childcare, and it's been really difficult for a fragile sector to adjust to this as well. And so what we're seeing now is these multiple pressures coming together, and we've got a real recruitment and retention crisis in childcare, where providers really struggle to find qualified staff. And the result of that has been that we've seen closures, both short term, we can't take children today, or we have to prioritise some children over other children today, or for weeks, or even permanently if it's just not possible to find that staff. So taking all of that into account, as I said, I think we're going to see that it becomes harder for families to be able to access the childcare that meets children's needs and parents' needs, and that is affordable. And this research is therefore so useful to start thinking about what are some of the other effects that this could have if there are increased difficulties around childcare availability. It's a troubled sector that is too often viewed as a market rather than a social good and part of our infrastructure. But there are significant strengths to our system as well that I think are worth focusing on. That the early years foundation stage is a strong evidence-based approach supporting children to develop. There are amazing people working in the sector and settings that are really helping children to thrive. I just get really frustrated because I see such huge potential that are not quite being achieved at the moment. So I'm going to pick up on some of those policy implications that we started talking about. And obviously this is very related to COVID, and we really hope that we're never going to see something like that quite happen again. But we know that we will see breaks in childcare availability again. Aside from any of these sort of acts of God that we've seen already, it's becoming increasingly common, as I said, to have short notice closures when you can't find the staff. We also have school holidays, which I think are a really interesting one to think about. Schools close 6 times a year, meaning that families have to change all their care arrangements. And then there's also staff and child sickness, which affects availability. And it raises really interesting questions about what are the effects of these breaks that are both planned, like school holidays, where they're coming, can plan in advance, and the unplanned closures as well, or unavailability. And particularly to think, one of the things that I'd be really interested in knowing, and I can't answer, so I'm just raising questions here, is about whether there's a difference between when things are planned and when they're unplanned. But I think what this research really usefully gives us is it means it's very fair to make an assumption that the impacts are going to be gendered, and that it's going to be mothers who carry the mental load around sorting out these different issues and the effect that that has on their mental health. They're the ones that are going to have to be ready for rug to be pulled out under the feet and to manage an alternative arrangement. And for a long time, I've been talking about this. The childcare availability as being really crucial to mothers being able to work and the risk of mothers falling out of employment. And it's so interesting that that's not what was found, that actually mothers were doing it all, and we aren't seeing that employment impact. And in some ways, I feel like, is that progress? But it doesn't really feel like it is progress. It feels like there's just many expectations, and that toll on the mental health is really, really concerning. So I think it's particularly interesting to think about the difference between when childcare was just stopped, or schools were closed, childcare was closed during the pandemic, and the ongoing unreliability that we often see, or the temporary closures, and is there a difference between the two? So some of the work that we've done with parents was around the impact of COVID. Yes, it was completely disastrous when schools and childcare closed, and I don't want to underestimate how difficult that was for families to deal with. But actually, the unpredictability of the closures after that, when bubbles burst and around sickness, was in some ways much more stressful and more difficult to deal with. And that is also got an impact, and that's the bit that is more, I think, more comparable to the current issues around availability around childcare. So it was just another reason on top of the reasons that we're currently dealing with around it. And I also think it's really interesting to think about it. So this looked particularly about employment, whether working hours were reducing, but what's the longer term impact of this on the gender pay gap, I think is really interesting as well. That the effects that we found on mental health, really for me, I start thinking about if you're constantly managing those stresses, the effects on mental health and unreliability of childcare, the idea of progressing in work or doing anything more than scraping by or even downgrading feels very, very challenging. And I think I want to pick up the point that was made already about school holidays that I've already mentioned, because I think that's the bit that really is problematic for families and is links particularly closely to this research. It's because it's where we really feel that mental pinch, I think. And often I think school age childcare is looked at less than early years childcare and education, because costs are slightly lower, although they're fluctuating, they're more during the holidays, and they still can be really problematic for families. It's not seen, it doesn't get the same sort of focus of attention, but actually what families feed back to us is it's the constantly having to change those arrangements can really take a toll, and that families, when they're deciding about working arrangements, will look at the sums, but they'll also just look at how it feels, and the sort of stress of rearranging things so frequently can cause a lot of parents, a lot of mothers that we speak to decide it simply isn't worth working. And it's not surprising. So our research, our childcare surveys find that the holiday childcare is pretty patchy in availability. Only 1 in 4 local areas have enough holiday childcare for parents working full time, and that drops to just 7% for disabled children. Most of the parents we speak to put together a patchwork, relying on family, friends, a bit of holiday club, a bit of annual leave to get through particularly that long summer holidays. But it is a toll, and it's a toll particularly for mothers, I think. So finally, I'm going to talk a bit more about solution. I think we really see that the time for wholesale childcare reform has come, it's got to be now. But given the sort of fragility of the sector, it's also really important that we do that in conjunction with childcare providers and with families, that in order to keep availability available at all times. Otherwise there could be really severe disruption. We want to see a move towards early education childcare system that drives up quality and meets the needs of all children, but also meets the needs of parents and employers around reliability and affordability. And it is completely possible to do both of those at once. We want to see a childcare system where it's available for every child in every community, from the end of parental leave right through school, and when the parents are only paying what they can afford. I think the discussion is probably mainly going to be focusing on the sort of whole family needs, the parent needs, which is a really interesting aspect, and the wider implications of lack of availability on parents is a really important one to look at. But I just want to finish with a point that I started on about that dual purpose of early education and childcare, and that it is an excellent investment because of this. It's essential for parents, but also for children and their outcomes. Disadvantaged children start school 4.3 months behind their more advantaged peers on average. And we know that high quality early education is a golden opportunity to narrow that gap. So it is a gender issue, but it has potential that goes far beyond that we really would like to achieve as well.
right. Well, thank you very much for having been here today. It's really exciting. I share all the excitement with Birgitta. It's so nice to see people, actual people around. But also hello to everyone online. And thank you, Birgitta, and thank you, Alex, for having invited me to give this talk today. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit about some of the research that I've done together with a lot of colleagues in the UK and elsewhere. And hopefully that will, some of our findings will spark some of the debate and that we're going to have in the discussion that we're going to have later on. I don't have many questions, many answers for policy, but I think I do have a lot of questions. So, so I'm looking forward to hearing more in the discussion today. Okay, so let me start by saying that the COVID crisis was different from other crises, and this has already been mentioned widely over these couple of years. The 2008 crisis was a male-dominated crisis. It affected male-dominated sectors such as manufacturing or the financial sector. With COVID, it was female-dominated sectors that were much greater hit. The leisure, the health, and the education sectors where women are overrepresented. And it also had a labor supply shock component to it. So childcare and schools were closed. So parents were finding it more difficult to actually work. And we've talked about the gender dimension of the crisis, and I think the arguments that we often make are arguments around equity, and I totally support that argument as a woman, as a mother. But I think we should also emphasize the efficiency argument of losing female talent to shocks that have a gender component, a strong gender component, such as the COVID shock has had. It is shown that the allocation of female talent to where it is more productive is good for economic growth. There is a recent paper showing this for the United States, but there are lots of papers showing this already. So we shouldn't underestimate the efficiency arguments from the gendered effects from economic crisis or COVID. So the first paper that I want to present is joint work with Catalina Muedo, who is based in the University of California, and Miriam and Marina, who are based in Spain. And what we did as COVID hit and our children were around the house, we decided to look at the data and to see how COVID was affected other women and other mothers. And the data that we had at hand, readily available, was the current population survey in the US, which is a monthly survey that continued to be collected during this time. So that allowed us very quick access to the data. And what we saw straight away, and what the Bureau of Labor Statistics showed straight away, is that these crises was affecting women's job much more than men. So what we wanted to, and here is some employment figures of what the shock was about. Here we have until October 21. We now have data, and we followed this trend up until now. There's still not convergence, so the picture is pretty much as we see it. But in the time of the pandemic, those vertical lines, we saw a big decrease in employment for women. That's the red line, fewer employment loss or lesser employment loss for men. And what we wanted to investigate, hours of work, was really, we wanted to disentangle the effect of the school closures from the effect of other policies and the COVID shock that was going around. And that was tricky, as Birgitta has mentioned. You need some variation in the school closures that is unrelated to the COVID crisis or to other lockdown policies or to other sort of distance policies that were being implemented. And in the United States, we had that perfect experiment because we had information of school closures at the district level, education district level. So that is a much smaller unit than the county, and counties are within states. So it's a particularly small region. So what we collected almost manually this data on the school closures at the school level district. And the CPS is the unit of observation is at the county level. So with this school district data, we constructed a school closure indexes at the county level. And with that variation, we were able to isolate the effect of school closures from other things that were going on at the same time in the United States. So very quickly, what we found interestingly is that we saw that COVID has had an effect, differential for men and women in terms of, particularly in terms of employment. However, school closures, what we find applying this statistical technique is that it affected women's and men's, particularly mothers and fathers, more or less equal in terms of hours of work. It didn't seem to affect employment. Of course, there were other things like, firms closing down that affected employment, but a school closure particularly affected hours of work. And in the short term, it seemed to affect equally mothers and fathers. We were limited with the data, long-term effects or longer-term effects up to October. If we follow these mothers, they do seem to suffer in the longer term, and the previous speaker talked a little bit about that. However, it is still a challenge to study longer-term outcomes, so I don't want to emphasize that here. So we talked a little bit as well about household time allocation and the gendered impacts of COVID and potentially of the school closures, although, as I said before, in the short run, we don't see much. However, as the previous speaker was saying, what were men and women, mothers and fathers doing? So a lot of my research talks about what men and women do. I've been talking about this for years. I mean, when you look at diary surveys, which is my specialty, and I'll present some of these today, when we look at what individuals do over a 24-hour period, we ask them every X minutes about their activities. We can have very precise estimates of their use of time. And some of my work using these surveys has shown that individuals, particularly women, spend a lot of time in housework and primary childcare, which is what I present here. Obviously, when you look at time with children, is much greater. But the diaries are able to capture this childcare. I mean, just the amount of housework is stunning, I think, for anybody in the room. So COVID made this worse, much worse. And some studies that have already mentioned, we collected data on the additional amount of housework and childcare for families. That was the paper with Sarah Smith at Bristol. We also collected data that was funded by Nuffield on what mothers and fathers were doing. And this study was quite innovative and excited for me at the time because it wasn't clear how you collect diary survey in remotely or using online surveys. So diary surveys are traditionally very paper-based surveys. You leave the paper, you leave the diary, the respondent answers. So this was quite challenging. And in this particular survey that we did with the IFS team, so Sarah Cotton was the principal investigator, we collected these diaries asking individuals or parents every 1 hour slot. We gave them a bunch of activities, 4, 5, 6, depending on their situation, to choose from. So let me know when I'm running out of time. So, because I can talk a lot. So let me just go to the findings. So what we saw here, so this is 1 hour slots when parents are reporting doing some childcare, housework, or paid work. They can be multitasking. So this is not, that they're doing 10 hours of only childcare. They report to be doing childcare in that particular hour. So in 10 hours of the day, they're reporting doing childcare, and the numbers speak for themselves. So you can see the light green bars are mothers, and the darker ones are fathers. So the unequal division of household labor is evident, and that has an impact on the amount of time that mothers and fathers work. And what was interesting about the diary that we collected was that we could also track the timing of that work. And I think this is particularly relevant for the discussion today. So we talk about we often discuss how much childcare we need for families to be able to go and work. I think the timing of that work and that childcare is really important, particularly now that we're moving towards more flexible working, more unpredictable schedules in a way at work. How is childcare going to adapt to these new demands? So the timing of these activities are important as well. And what we see here is that leisure, personal care, sleep, they follow the same patterns for men and women. But when it comes to paid work, housework, and childcare during the core paid work hours is what is really hindering women from doing more paid work, and particularly during COVID. So we also explored with a different type of diary some gender differences in life satisfaction. This is still work in progress and is very much what Birgitta mentioned before. Mothers seem to be more affected by COVID, and we're still not recovering. And this is, again, from several time-use diaries that we collected. And I don't have the results today, but part of it is isolation. So we see the time spent in leisure activities, particularly through the social distancing policies, affected women more so than men. And we have the time diaries to show that. So where do we go from here? So when we talk about the gender aspect of COVID or the different economic shocks, I think childcare is definitely an answer, and probably some of you will be talking about that, I'm sure. I also wanted to talk a little bit about remote working and how we can design remote work so that it works, and maybe how we can combine both the childcare provision and the way that we organize work so that it works not just for families, not just for parents, but also for children, of course. So just to close off, a cautionary note on remote working. We did a survey to find out how COVID was affecting a number of individuals in the financial sector. So these are high-powered men and women, career-oriented men and women. And the bottom line of what we found was that flexible work didn't really change much of the way these individuals worked in terms of teamwork and in terms of deadlines, but it did affect the unpredictability of the working schedule. And that is bad news, particularly for mothers who currently are the ones, as I've shown, that have to take care of the household needs, because and also in the data we see that unpredictability is one of the major causes for leaving the industry or leaving the work in this particular group of individuals. So just the cautionary tale about flexible work, I think it is great at the personal level, but I think it may come with challenges that we need to consider. So I'm going to close here. Thank you very much.
Yes, I'm one of the shorter people, so great. So you can see, yes. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. It's great to be here, and it's been fascinating so far. I'm going to be talking about findings from the IFS Deaton Review of Inequality, which Alex mentioned. So just to give you a very brief overview of the review. So it is a long 5-year major study of inequalities, looking at why does it matter, dimensions of inequalities are related, and thinking about sort of policy implications as well. We're partway through, and we've been collecting a lot of evidence, bringing in lots of different authors to provide that evidence, and we haven't come to any conclusions yet. So I suppose I should also say that what I'm going to say here today isn't sort of officially from the panel perspective, but it's my take on some of the findings so far. So there's the first volume is an evidence volume, and this is pretty much complete now, covering lots of different areas. One of them being the chapter on gender, which I'm going to draw on. In terms of gender inequalities, as well as the chapter written by Alison Andrew and Oriana Bandiera and Monica Costa Diaz and Camille Landais, there have also been written commentaries which have really kind of informed the discussion from different perspectives. So Fran Bennett and Lynn Prince-Cook have provided sort of really interesting commentaries. Fran particularly looking at poverty and austerity, but also the household perspective. Lynn Prince-Cook taking into account issues of sort of hierarchy and power that are less present in the chapter itself. And there's also an accompanying chapter by Claudia Goldin and others, which is looking at the pattern of working among higher educated women in the US specifically, which brings further insights. And then I've written a kind of commentary, not only just bringing some of the key findings together, but also sort of trying to make some observations, and that will be clearly informing what I say today. I'm going to be particularly giving some examples from the chapter, and then move on to try and weave in some of those other perspectives in my last 3 slides, and I'm going to keep an eye on the time as well. So by way of context, have we got to a situation kind of stalled progress? So we saw the Equal Pay Act in 1970 and the Sex Equality Act in 1975. So these were aiming to level the playing field. This is quite a long time ago now. And there has been some change in the intervening decades. Women have exceeded men's educational attainment, where you measure it at all points and all measures. And they've entered the workplace in larger numbers. They increasingly combine family and work, as we've been hearing something about some of that already. And they have become more represented in positions of power and influence. So we're currently seeing some of the challenges to being represented in a position of power and influence in these last few days. But we remain far from parity. Women do the lion's share of care work, we've been seeing, and we've been talking particularly about childcare, but I think we shouldn't be forgetting the amount of elder care that is now necessitated and was also exacerbated during the pandemic, and is also part of the crisis in care that's been talked about, and that again, women do the lion's share of this. They continue to experience a large gap in average and lifetime earnings, and we also see, ongoing issues of violence against women and differences in power that I think we should keep as part of this discussion. It's not just on the economic issues. So let's give some context, international context from to the earnings gap, thinking about the earnings gap in particular in the next few slides. So you can think about the earnings gap as coming from three components. It comes from differences in participation, so whether women have employment rates that are the same as men or not. It comes from differences in hours given employment, and it comes from differences in earnings per hour. You can see that across these countries, illustrated here, that earnings gap is found across the countries, but it's very different in size, and it's also quite different in the extent of the components that contribute to it. The UK has a kind of a sort of substantial, sort of been middling in that distribution, earnings gap of around 40%. So that means women's earnings are on average 40% of men's. It's in the UK, participation plays a relatively small part of that. There are differences in participation. Women's employment rates are not the same, but it's lower than in some countries. However, hours plays quite a big part. So even if women in work, they're not working the same number of hours. The way there are wage gaps as well, hourly wage gaps. They're not as large as in some countries, but they're still substantial. I'm actually going to use these because so thinking about what's happened over time, this is an illustration of the earnings gap and how it's declined over the last 25 years. An initial look at this looks like, okay, that red line, that looks like quite a big decline. But then if you look at the scale on the right-hand side, you can see that the scale actually goes from 40 to 55. Yes, there's been a decline, but there's still a big gap. The earnings gap has declined in fact, by around 13 percentage points from 1995. But, and that's the but here at the head of the slide, but this is largely driven by increases in education. And I think all of the panel, when we first saw these findings about it being driven by increases in education, we were actually quite surprised. We know there have been increases in education, but that in a sense, this is the only thing going on in that decline in the earnings gap was quite startling. Given those increases in education, the earnings gap has barely declined. So because more educated women are more likely to be in work in the workplace, they're more likely they work for longer hours on average, and they and this means that all of the decline in the participation gap, half of the decline in the hours gap, and most of the decline in the wage gap can be attributed to changes in qualifications. And I've got an illustration of that here. So if you look at the top row, that's you can see the decline. So you've got declines in participation. I can see it myself. Participation, and it should be hours and earnings. And then you see the red line is the net of so cancelling out for education, net of education. You see that those lines are much flatter, or are flat in some cases. And the bottom one shows the sort of the actual gaps, the gaps at different levels of education in terms of participation, hours, and earnings. It's only among those with less than A levels, so the relatively low educated group, for whom the earnings group gap has closed. And that's been largely due to declining male earnings rather than particularly improvements in women's earnings. And these women, of course, less likely to be in paid work in the first place. And we've also seen, which has been a change over time, that wage gaps are now larger for more educated women. And they're particularly high among higher paid workers. I mean, this is partly because of the potential for gaps to be bigger if there's higher pay. But it has been a change, and it's not the same in all contexts as well. So this is where wage gaps are most striking now. Okay. So why? Well, it's kids. So these are the illustrations which show the what happens on the birth of a child to men's and women's weekly earnings. So the top line is men's and the bottom line is women's, and you can see that overall at that point men's are sort of flattish with a slight increase, and women's drop quite dramatically. And you can also see that this happens in terms of that it's a drop in labour force participation among women, but for those in work it's also a drop in hours worked. Those who stay in work, so they still reduce those hours. And you can see the hourly wage rate for those in work is less affected at the beginning, but because of these other changes, because of this reduction in hours, and that reduction in hours is also often accompanied by a change of job, that the wage rate is also declining, and that gap in the wage rate is increasing over time. So there's a long-standing debate over whether these sorts of patterns are just driven by specialisation. Now, I would have thought by now we would have given up on the idea that this is just specialisation, that men are going to earn more, and so it makes more sense on the birth of a child for a woman to drop out of the labour market. But we still have this discussion, so let's just show that it's not. And this is some of the work that Almudena was involved in, talked about before. So this shows in COVID, so it's a good kind of I think Birgitta was saying how COVID was a kind of unfortunate but good experiment in this sense. Okay, what happens to paid work hours and to care and housework hours during COVID, looking at whether it was the woman who earned more or the man who earned more. And you can see that even where the woman earned more, she's still increasing her housework and childcare hours more than the man is. So no, it's not specialisation, and this is consistent with other findings from the chapter itself, which shows that the pattern is exactly the pattern I showed you before. As you can see, it's basically exactly the same, even when the woman earned more before the birth of the child. So these household level decisions are not taken on economic grounds. And it's particularly striking here, I think, because these are women who are earning more even after having had the child for a while. So some of those impacts would have already hit in for many of them. But these are women who've managed to maintain that earning, and they still do more. So that's not what's going on. So what is going on? Well, we're talking really about gendered norms and expectations. So we're seeing that there are gendered expectations of care and caring, and that these norms and expectations influence the decisions men and women take at every stage of their lives. So they influence their educational decisions, they influence their employment choices, they influence their decisions when they're within the household, and outside the household as well. And this clearly, as Almudena said, leads to a big waste of women's and men's potential. And these norms don't just affect mothers; they affect all of us. So I think here the Golden Cohen-Aliberti chapter on the US context is quite interesting, because it shows how over time higher educated women's earnings do recover as their children leave home. They recover in the extent that they catch up with non-mothers' earnings. They never catch up with fathers' earnings. And that's by the same token, so women who don't have children can't hope to match men who do have children. So these norms are clearly very important, and they also, because they also influence not only what couples do within the household, but they influence how others respond to men and women. And we all do this. You know, none of us are immune from these. When employers responding to requests for flexible working respond differently to requests from men and women, for example. How people make assumptions about capability are clearly highly gendered, and we're all participating in this. I have, I think, 1 minute left, so I think I'm all right. So I also wanted to stress this point that also physical power and what Olympians Cook refers to as sort of the gendered hierarchy also feed norms and impact private and public spheres in the UK. So how people behave, how they respond to these. This is also something, given the topic around the pandemic today, this is something that's home not being necessarily a safe place for women was really noted during the pandemic. As one of these issues, and this idea that we can separate out what's going in the taking place in the private sphere from what's taking place in the public sphere, I think is again one of those things that is no longer sustainable, even if it continues to be explored as if there is this separation. The lack of representation of women in positions of power and authority does also continue to shape our status hierarchy, and also the political willingness to address gendered inequalities. It's not impossible to have shifts to the status quo. Again, Olympians Cook talks about, for example, on women's shortlists and so on. But she also cautions that we do see, if things move too fast, we do see backlash, which can also have negative impacts. And the final point, the sort of final challenge is of course, the intergenerational argument that children are shaped by what they observe. So we've talked a lot about childcare and how to provide more childcare and better childcare. But what if all that childcare has been provided by women? What do then children observe? How does that shape their expectations of the future? We know that they are shaped by what they see around them, and their expectations are driven by this. So we need change. We need changes within the family. We need changes in how care is delivered if we are going to influence those intergenerational patterns. Okay, so I think I'm out of time, so I'll just leave you with the slide here. Just to say the last point, that I think to address gender inequalities, we don't just need to target women. We need to also promote men's opportunities and incentives to undertake caring roles.
Wow. That has been an absolutely fantastic set of presentations. There's sort of so much material to unpick in those, and we will start to try and do that at the panel discussion that's taking place after a very short break. We will be back online at sort of after 5 minutes, so 11:23. So look forward to seeing those of you online in 5 minutes time, and those of you in the room, just a very, very short coffee and comfort break. Thank you all. Welcome back, everyone. Thanks for getting back into the room so promptly. So we've checked that the panelists have their mics on. Can I remind online participants that you can submit questions in the Q&A section online. You can also use the chat for observations, etc. When the time comes, those of you in the room, please raise your hand to ask a question, and a mic will be brought to you. And you must use the mic, otherwise those online and those with hearing loss won't be able to hear you. And also stand up and please introduce yourself. And there will be prizes awarded for everyone that remembers all of those things. Right. So may I take great pleasure in introducing the panelists. So we've got Carey Oppenheim, the Nuffield Foundation's lead on early childhood. Her previous roles have included Chief Executive of the Early Intervention Foundation, the co-director of the Institute of Public Policy Research. We've got John Penrose MP, Conservative MP for Weston-super-Mare since 2005, who along with Siobhan McDonough MP is supporting the Cross-Party Commission on Childcare launched by the Social Market Foundation. And then we've got Josie Irwin, who's got a long track record of leading change in trade union, health services and local government organisations, and is Senior National Officer for Equality with Unison. So thank you very much to all of you. So much material to draw upon. I just ask you to start, Carey, with your sort of initial reflections on what leapt out at you for the lessons for policy and practice for childcare and gender equality.
Thank you, Alex, and what a brilliant set of presentations, so rich and very hard to do justice to. So just in terms of immediate reflections, I think in combination, they provide a powerful case for looking at the wider benefits of childcare provision and schools as not only supporting children's development, but also women's entry and being able to stay in jobs and the labour market, but also women's mental health and well-being, which I think has had much less emphasis. So this is really important, both new research and new way of thinking about those issues, as well as the efficiency arguments that were also talked about in terms of underusing people's and women's talents and the ability that good early years provision, good childcare after school, and the role of schools enables that to happen. I think it also illuminates the importance, the interconnected nature of all these issues, that we need to think about children, mothers and fathers and their families in a holistic way, and that we need data and services and financial support to be joined up actually if we're going to improve people's lives. And as we know, whether it's policy making or service delivery at national level or local level, these things are very compartmentalized. I was also struck, and I think, Megan, you talked about this, about just thinking about the way that childcare tends to be thought about as being about care, and schools tend to be thought about as thinking about education. And how, and we saw this in the pandemic very strongly, they are so fundamentally about both, and the ways in which schools had to start to play different roles in relation to thinking about what children were eating, how to connect people and stay in contact. So I think it's very important to kind of bear that in mind, but that, and also so interesting, and as we know, but to see that confirmed by the research about the impact that has, particularly on women's lives. And I guess the big issue is about the intersection of work and care and the importance of care, and just what an important and challenging issue it is to change the norms, the way in which we think about care between women and men. So those are the kind of big things. Just very briefly, in terms of thinking about when we were doing the changing face of early childhood, so thinking about it through that lens. Some of the key recommendations were about making early years education and childcare, a core part of integrated systems of family support. So we need to be thinking about it both from the child's perspective, but also from the family perspective. So how do we join, their current policy initiatives in relation to family hubs, in relation to improvements in childcare, but in very, very difficult contexts? How do we join that up? How do we have a vision that brings those things together? Policies around time, and I'm sure we'll talk about this. We don't talk enough about time, and I absolutely agree with some of the things that were already highlighted. How do we really address the gap between the very gendered way in which we provide maternity and parental leave and paternity leave. And that's a responsibility not only of government policy, but also for employers, and how we change the culture to really make a difference in terms of how that is shared. There's a big gap, as people here know, in terms of the availability of childcare in the early stages, from the end of maternity pay to universal free childcare at the age of 3. And this, and what is the right balance between financial support to enable more care to be done at home, childcare provision to enable people to go out to work, and what's best at which ages, and how do we really look afresh at that? And then, of course, the pandemic put a spotlight on how central earliest education and childcare is to children's and parents' lives. I mean, it is an anchor, and just how fragile that system is. And I think there is a really important role, and we'll talk about this a bit more in more detail, about what we do in the short term to kind of shore up the system, but what we need to do in the long term. And I was really struck by the fact that these changes in work patterns, more flexibility, greater insecurity and uncertainty, and how do we create a childcare and early education system that is able to respond to those changes in work patterns?
Thank you very much, Carey. Can I go to you now, John?
Sure. Look, firstly, thank you to Nuffield for organising this, and for everybody who came up with such really fascinating and properly evidenced presentations. I was saying, you and I were talking earlier on, and was saying evidence-based policy making is often out of style, and it flipping well shouldn't be. So that we need to have more stuff like this, please. It's absolutely essential. So thank you for organising it in the first place. And I think that at a sort of really top line reaction to all the research presented so far is it flipping told us so. It confirmed what I think all of us probably in this room had feared. It gave lots and lots of really important and useful texture, and showed that there's a long-term underlying issue with a huge glass ceiling, mainly affecting women with childcare, and it got even worse or more acute during the pandemic. But what it was doing was colouring in valuable detail and texture around something which I suspect, because we all took the trouble to sign up to coming to this event in the first place, we all suspected, feared, knew in varying degrees before we even walked in the room. And so the question is, I think, well, what are we going to do about it then? There has been some improvement. We saw that, mainly based on education. But there's still a heck of a long way to go. And the thing which I took away from listening to the data, and which I'm going to be sort of trying to take back to the Childcare Commission, which you mentioned in the introduction, which I'm doing with the Social Market Foundation with Siobhan Madonna as well, is that actually quite a lot of the time, perhaps understandably, the debate in Westminster is all about government subsidy and those sorts of things. Actually, that's going to be a factor, absolutely. But there's a whole series of other things that if we don't look at them, we're treating symptoms, not causes, if I can put it that way. So there's a whole series of things about developing social attitudes and sort of long-term social trends about gendered roles in families and in equally gendered roles in workplaces, which, yes, there's been some progress, great, but my goodness me, what a heck of a long way we've got to go, and it's not a picture which varies dramatically between different sectors as well as between different employers within those sectors as well. So there's a huge task there. There's clearly also a huge task in reducing, that will help to reduce demand for childcare or to spread the provision of childcare between parents more evenly. But also a huge thing about how we design our school day and our school week and our school terms, and do that more effectively, as well as how we do the same for preschool childcare. And I completely, it's always helpful to be reminded that schools do both as well. So I think all of those are things which policymakers need to understand. I think that there are differences in nuance, but the thing which has really struck me about this is that it is a cross-party issue. I mean, you'll find different approaches and different prejudices, I'm afraid, on all sides of the political debate. But I asked a question about this, Prime Minister's questions about 6 months ago, and I had MPs from all parties coming up to me afterwards saying, thank you for raising it, really important. So it is a cross-party issue. And I guess the final point, which I think just needs to be got at, is we didn't really have a chance to address it sort of in detail here today, but I think there's a really big issue with the costs of this sector as well. And if you have an industry, the childcare sector I'm talking about here, so particularly preschool, but not only preschool, as we just heard. If you have a sector where most staff are underpaid, most childcare providers aren't making any money. In fact, many of them are going out of business. And most prices are unaffordable for a very large number of people who would like to take it on, then clearly there's a structural problem with the costs of this thing in the first place. And I think policymakers need to play their part. They're not the only part of it, but they will have important input into how we solve that fundamental underlying problem too. So I'll stop there, but just absolutely fascinating, and thank you very much for arranging it.
You're very welcome. Thank you for that, and thank you for those, the breadth of those reflections. Josie, do you have anything to add? I'm sure you've got a sort of long perspective on, both the issues raised and the gaps still left to fill.
Thanks very much, Alex, and thanks very much to the Nuffield Foundation for hosting the event along with University of Essex as well. And I'd echo both Carey and John's comments about the research and the quality of the presentations. And it was, as always, great for me to listen to them from a trade unionist perspective, because I'm always looking for that evidence base to make the arguments to policymakers and those that take the policy decisions. And as John rightly said, actually what we heard has underpinned everything we already know, but in spades. And it's fantastic always to have quality evidence-based research on which to make arguments, because you've already heard from John how much politicians listen to, or some politicians should listen to evidence-based arguments. So the evidence we heard emphasised and exposed the gendered impact of COVID. Just picking up on Birgitta, your research, as always listening to other people's research, it throws some other questions up about what you'd like to hear more about. And we know, for example, that women start from a lower base in terms of mental health, for example, and as well as the issues which you talked about in relation to childcare and caring for adults that others refer to at home, there's also the impact of long COVID. So there's a long term issue I'd like to hear more about. There are also some intersectional issues which some of the presentations touched upon. So as a woman caring for children, if you were from an ethnic minority community and caring for your children, there was likely to be an even bigger impact, and you may have started from a lower base in terms of your mental health as well. If you were disabled and a woman and caring for children, there would have been more of an impact. But I'm also interested because Unison, as the UK's largest trade union in the UK with 1.3 million members, just to push in that little plug. Most of our members are also women across the public services. Some are childcare workers, some are care assistants. They're the lowest, the lowest pay. So for us, class, where you work and what job you work in, is also an issue. And I was interested in what you were saying, Almudena, from the point of view of the gender pay gap. So we know that low-paid women were particularly affected. Only 1 in 10 low-paid jobs can be done from home. So the working from home solution and the flexibility that that may provide isn't one that can impact very much on you if you're a cleaner or you're a caterer. So we know also that 1 in 6 women, mainly those on the lowest pay, had to reduce their hours at work, and some had to give up their work because of the work they were doing, or childcare closures. And the unpredictability that one of the presentations touched on was really important in terms of ongoing impacts. So we also carried out a survey in Unison at the height of the pandemic in February 2021. It wasn't particularly methodologically sound, so academics will need to put their fingers in their ears, and we used SurveyMonkey. Oh dear. But we did receive responses from 47,000 women in a week. Mostly were low paid in part-time jobs. Between some of them were earning between £15,000 and £18,000. So we're talking kind of really low paid here. Some were care workers, some were cleaners and council workers. The majority, 57%, were still working in their usual workplace. And this is where I want to come back to Birgitta's research, because nearly 2/3 of them said that they weren't sleeping well. More than half were not taking regular breaks, and a significant number said that they felt stressed most of the time. And actually, when we also had 1,000 of those women who told us a little bit more about what they were concerned about, which was really, really interesting. And they said that it was the impact of the pandemic on their children that was the main source of their worry. 61% said that. They were worried about the mental health of their children, and 45% were concerned about how their education was being impacted. And now, of course, we've got the additional stress of the cost of living, which I'm sure we'll come back to at some point. So the big overall lesson for us from what we already know about what's happened in the pandemic to women, and for longer term lessons for the discussion, is that until society recognises that it's women who take on the majority of caring responsibilities at home and have to balance those with their work responsibilities, the pay gap will remain stubbornly wide. And the failure to address childcare, and I was going to say the government's failure to address childcare, but that I think would be actually unfair. Successive governments, and all of our efforts, for those of us that are involved in politics in all sorts of different ways, is our collective failure. And I think it's a scandal that full-time nursery provision for children under the age of 2 costs almost 2/3 of a parent's weekly take-home pay in England. And I think, you know, the cost of living increases, the crisis now is putting additional strains on families, but particularly women. And our research, again, not methodologically, academically sound, but nevertheless it's showing that public service workers, and these are the people that are actually providing the childcare, providing the social care, blah-de-blah-de-blah, some of them are taking 2nd or 3rd jobs now to pay for their childcare, and some are leaving work altogether because they cannot afford nursery fees. So we need to do something. And we'll come back to, because it won't surprise you to know that I have views on what we need to do as well. But I'll shut up now, Alex. And
yeah, thank you ever so much, Josie. I mean, I think you made an important point about the role of evidence on which to make arguments, because I think many of us sort of sitting here in the room will reflect on our own individual experiences of coping during the pandemic, of, you know, juggling work and family life generally. And whilst, you know, those sort of experiences are incredibly, you know, important and relevant, sort of recognizing the sort of diversity of experiences that exist, and, you know, realizing that, you know, working from home isn't you know, a panacea, is incredibly important. You know, also, you know, we've got other research that shows that from Ruth Gaunt, who was looking at caregiving dads and breadwinning mums, and they actually found that, you know, couples that were in equal share work and care arrangements, the mothers there had the highest levels of satisfaction with their sort of division of responsibilities. But we know that sort of often equal sharing is facilitated by some degree of flexible working. And again, that's not a choice that is available to all. And where it is, it's often at sacrifice of pay and progression opportunities. So there are, you know, those roles for employers there as well as for the state and the sort of childcare systems. But I'd like to throw it open to you and take and the opportunity to sort of provide some reflections or ask some questions. So we're going to go to a question in the room first, and then we'll go for a question online. Does anyone in the room have a question? Thank you. Please stand up, say who you are, where you're from.
Hi, I'm Anne Fennell, Chair of Mothers at Home Matter. I've got two questions really. One is around the wording on childcare, the way we talk about childcare. So it's often talked of as a burden. It hinders women from working in more productive areas. It's a waste of women's potential, and we're losing women's talents. But what if we saw it as the most important job in the world? What if the role was really valued? If we actually paid carers properly, or we actually recognise that role as important, I think that might affect how men see it as well. If we saw it as a joy, would it change the way we talked about childcare as a whole? The other question I had was on the gender pay gap. There is a biological factor, and your evidence does show that women's earnings are pretty similar to men's, but they drop when you have children. There is evidence that women would like to be at home with their children, especially when they're very young. And how do we value that, whether that's in economic terms or just in terms of valuing that role? The Department for Education Service put out the question, if I could afford it, I would work fewer hours so I could spend more time looking after my children. And the majority of mothers agreed with that. And the other question was, if I could arrange good quality childcare, which was convenient, reliable and affordable, I would work more hours. That was disagreed upon. So how do we find that middle ground where also you can afford to be at home as well as be able to go to work and have that choice? So it's really, how do we include that in the argument around childcare?
Thank you very much. Josie, can I go to you first to respond?
Yeah, such an excellent question, I have to say, and I think you've actually gone to the heart of the matter. And I think one of the things we need to do in addressing the whole issue is consider how women's work is valued. And when I say work, the economic value of the work that women do in the home, not just in terms of what they're doing in a formal work setting. And I think you're right. If you begin to address that, but as I think Lucinda pointed out, the legislation about changing equal pay for work of equal value was over 50 years ago, and we haven't really kind of gone very far. It is a whole scale, different cultural way of looking at what women do, because of course you're right, it's the part-time opportunities for women that they do to balance and work and flex around their children that need to be valued, and that work also needs to be paid well enough for women to be able to afford the excellent early years and childcare that they deserve. So I can't kind of wave a magic wand and answer the question because it's so big, but that I think goes to the heart of it.
I can respond, but if you want to fit in more questions, but keep going.
Yeah, it's just so we can fit in as many questions as we can. Are there any questions online? Claire, I know you're keeping an eye out for them.
Yeah, there are. Thank you, Alex. So the first one is from Tracy Shinkins-Watson, who is Partnerships Manager at the London Early Years Foundation. And her question is about fragmentation in the early years sector. She said that nursery providers and early years settings provide the perfect opportunity to be able to engage with families, but we know that there is a real challenge in getting families to access early years education and childcare. The current provision is really only able to provide long-term support to families that can afford it. Also, 85% of early years providers are privately owned, resulting in less cohesion. So what can we do to reduce the fragmentation in the early years sector?
Carey, can I go to you on this one, please?
I think it is a real issue, and it isn't an easy issue to solve. And I think one of the difficulties is that we're not thinking about sort of early childhood in the round. So we think about the childcare and the education separately from the other things that families also need support. So, you know, I think that the development of family hubs, although quite limited at this stage and, you know, not funded very well, is a really important part, and that we need to be thinking about how early education and childcare is part of that and linked to supporting the family more broadly. In terms of fragmentation, I think it's part of a bigger question. When we were doing the work around early education and childcare, we came to the conclusion that we needed a review, that the system is dysfunctional, John, in the way that you talk about, that actually it's not meeting the needs of any of the key players, and it needs a fresh look. We obviously need to be doing things in the short term. And the issue about attendance and take up is a really important one. And we know from the data in relation to 2-year-olds that 1 in 3 children are missing out on, it's for disadvantaged children, are missing out on that provision. And just thinking about how we work alongside mothers and fathers to improve the attendance and improve the access. And that's not just, it really is about working together on that. It's not just about just thinking about, we'll not solve that by just increasing availability. It's about how we work together on it.
Thank you, Carey. Do we have another question in the room?
Hi everyone, my name's Eleanor Island. I'm one of the programme heads at the Nuffield Foundation, and I work in the area of early years education. Thank you so much to all the presenters and panellists today. It's absolutely incredible, all the presentations that we've seen. And I don't think I've ever seen research findings which have made me quite so angry. Now, popular opinion might suggest that we've got gender equality in this country, and it's really, really clear that we're not. That we haven't. And looking at the gender balance in this room, it wouldn't be an unfair assumption to say that actually most of us have probably experienced this on a personal level, as well as being able to look at the findings. And it's important to remind ourselves, I think, who's benefiting from this situation, and why are things still so unequal? So my question is, and sorry if it's a bit blunt, but how do we get men to care? Like, not just about gender inequality, but how do we get them to care for our children? How do we get them to care for our elderly? And how do we get them to work in the caring industries? Thanks.
I mean, as our male representative here, John, would you like to have a go at this one first?
I mean, this is A, central, and B, really hard. Yeah, because the role of government in this sort of area government has to be involved, but thinking that government has got the answer or can be all the answer is just fairy tale stuff. This is about driving long-term social attitudinal change, and that's, yes, governments have a role in that, clearly, and you can do everything from all sorts of nudge programs through to changing education styles and so forth. But actually, it's about a societal shift as well. And attitudes do change. They change pretty slowly. I think we've made quite a lot of progress in this area over decades, but you're absolutely right to say there's just decades more to go. And so I'm not sure, I think any minister who stands up and says, I'm going to sort of, give this a massive shove and we're going to move 10 years in 10 days, is just kidding themselves and all of us as well. But government needs to be involved in this. Yes, absolutely, and I think there are nudge programs and so forth which matter. But it also kind of links back to the first question, because I think that the point about valuing the work that women do is partly a question of it can be really importantly influenced, positively or negatively, by the language which policymakers use, one way or another, and we can influence it in a positive or a negative direction if we get that wrong. But also in the kinds of choices that we take. And if we do start to, for example, change the way that school hours work, as I was talking about before, or the way that, or encouraging employers, and whether they're private sector, public sector, third sector employers, address this kind of stuff, you can really make a difference, but it ain't going to be quick. I mean, you can see how far we've come, but it's taken, I don't know, 40 years, 50 years, and I think we're only halfway up the mountain now. Sorry not to have a complete answer to that.
Very disappointed you couldn't solve that one for us today, John. I mean, but I think, thinking about things that government could do, so looking at those sort of very, very early stages, and parental leave and the huge, the fact that the mother is allocated a huge bunch of maternity leave, and the father, gets a few weeks, having sort of more equal sort of distribution of that in the first instance might set us off on a new path where the role of women caring and the role of men caring as well starts to be equally valued. Right, we are running very short of time. We'll try and fit in one more quick question from online. Is there another one, Claire?
Yeah, there is. I'll go for a short one. So we've got a question from Liz Armand, who is asking a question relating to the point about childcare costs being among the highest in Europe, but providers struggling to stay in business and carer pay rates being low. Why is this the case? But I think this is the question really for the panel. What policy interventions could you suggest to address it?
Right. Okay. So this is the quick fire round. And right, can I start with you, Josie, first?
I think I'm going to echo what John said in response to the last question, which is it's really hard, which isn't very helpful at all. It's a chicken and an egg situation. Where on earth do you start? The childcare sector, from all that we've heard from the research, from all that we know, from all the recent articles in the media, is in a crisis, and it ain't going to be something that is resolved overnight. It needs a long-term solution. It's not something, as John rightly said, that can be resolved with a sweep of a pen by a policymaker and a politician. It needs all of us, whether we represent, as Unison does, workers in childcare who are also mothers, politicians, policymakers, evidence providers, to combine together to provide some thinking about a long-term sustainable solution, which also might have the byproduct of starting to change social attitudes as well.
Thank you.
But my short and sweet, and again, I don't want to prejudge the results of the Childcare Commission, which I'm part of. So we aren't there yet, but my guess is that what we'll want to come up with is, I think as a society, we need to make sure we are clear about the standards that we want to be achieving, the outcomes we want to be achieving from our childcare outside school in particular. And my guess is at the moment that we've got a one-size-fits-all set of outcomes that we're aiming for. And for some people, that's fine. But for lots and lots of other families, it's not fine, either because they need much more intensive early, if you're part of a troubled family, you need much more intensive early intervention. Other people don't need anything like that and want something that's cheap and safe. And there's all sorts of other things in between. But at the moment, we have this sort of one-size-fits-all thing. I'm not so sure about fragmentation, to an earlier problem being as much of an issue as the question made it sound. I think the question is, how do we deliver standards of childcare at levels which families need and want, and which they can choose, and they have the flexibility to choose what's right for them, and that those standards are delivered through whatever mechanisms. And it may be that actually it's a very heavily consolidated childcare sector that results, or it may be quite a fragmented childcare sector that results. But I think we should start with the standards first, and then let everything else follow from that.
Thank you, John. And over to you, Carey.
Thank you, Alex. I mean, I do think it is pretty extraordinary that we're prepared to tolerate the fact that we have a sort of a childcare and early education system that is so complex, that is not meeting people's needs. When we know that this is, a foundational stage of children's development, but also so central to women and families' lives. And so to change that, to kind of get the kind of priority that needs to be attached to that, I think is about having a bolder vision and ambition, where we see the key things for bringing up the next generation, love, nurture, protection, as really being a shared endeavour. It is both about, it's not just about mothers, it's about parents, it's about families, it's about the wider community, and it's about society at large. And I think, particularly in the kind of current context where we're going to have huge pressure on public finances, how do we sort of put to make sure that this issue really has the sort of the attention that it deserves, and that if we look after our young children, our children and parents, that is at the heart of building, a just, a resilient and a productive society. So we need a wider argument that starts to shift the consensus, and that involves the voices and experiences of parents themselves and all those who work in this field too.
Thank you. We're out of time, and following your words, Carey, it seems a wise place to stop. I mean, this discussion has just highlighted the breadth of issues, the challenges facing the childcare market, the importance of valuing care, the role of sort of schools and childcare in contributing to family well-being and mothers' mental health. We've had a sort of brief discussion about some of the types of things that might make a difference, but we've also talked about the fact that it'll probably take sort of a long time and that we need sort of long-term solutions. Part of Birgitta's presentation sort of looked at the specific impact of the COVID shock, and I think having a sort of sustainable and resilient system in place and set of supports in place, and one that both supports families and nurtures children every day, but also can respond to those moments of crisis, is incredibly important. Thank you very much to all of you who have joined us online today. Thanks to those of you that have joined us in person. For those in the room, there is lunch outside, and hopefully those online will get to treat you to lunch at some point in the future. Thank you very much, everybody.